Welcome back to the Big Ben Show. Happy to be joined today in studio by Mariam Wahba. She is a research analyst at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. You can follow her on X at the Mariam Wahba. That's WAHBA on X. Mariam, thanks so much for joining me in studio today. I wanted to talk to you about the conversation that has generally trickled, I think, into the awareness of most people who watch Fox or who pay attention to the news regarding the focus on what's been going on in Nigeria. I know that this is something that FDD has a program now that's focusing on the persecution of Christians in many parts of the world. Tell me a little bit about what's going on in Nigeria, why it has received the kind of focus that it has in recent weeks, and your thoughts on what the president is doing when he's talking about it lately.
Absolutely. It's good to be with you today. Thank you for having me. Look, we've seen Nigeria be catapulted into media headlines and national headlines over the last few days, but really over the last few weeks, we've seen that spike hit. And obviously it's due to POTUS's mentioning it in the Truth Post about the Christian persecution that's happening in Nigeria. But I think the story is much more nuanced and complicated than just that POTUS Truth Post. So Christian persecution happens all over Africa, all over the Middle East. Unfortunately, doesn't get as much attention. I can speak anecdotally, being a Coptic Christian myself and being part of a persecuted Christian community, on just how little the issue gets covered and how exciting it is when it does get attention, especially from the sitting president of the United States. The Nigeria issue has been happening for decades now. We've seen Christian attacks by Islamic, traditional or classical, for a lack of a better word, Islamist groups and non-Islamist groups. And here I'll make this distinction that I think is getting lost in the conversation that's happening is you have, again, for a lack of a better term, your classical Islamists, meaning ISIS, Boko Haram, ISWAP, the Islamic State. And those are active in Nigeria. And we're talking about a governance issue. The government is having a hard time dealing with these militant Islamists. And then you have this other bucket of Christian persecution that's happening, and it's what the president was talking about. And it's these Fulani herders that are attacking the Christian farmers. And I think that's where the story starts here.
Tell me in terms of the history of this, because I think people may have had this on their radar a little bit, but they may not know the history. What's been going on there in the last few years that has led up to this particular moment in terms of rising levels of attack, rising levels of violence? What are the different factors that go into this?
Absolutely. And look, one thing I'm realizing as I'm seeing all the reporting come out on this issue is there's a lot of folks contesting the issue instead of choosing to accept that it is an issue and then let's get our facts straight. Ted Cruz has been outspoken about this issue and has thrown out several numbers gathered by Nigerian and other think tanks and people who collect data. And I think the numbers were something like in the last year, more than 7,000 Christians have been murdered. In the last maybe 2 decades, we're looking at 52,000 Christians. Some numbers put it as high as 100,000. And obviously, it's really hard to keep track of those numbers in a country that is not as watched as, let's say, a country in the Middle East or on our side of the hemisphere. When it comes to understanding the complicated history of it, I think what is important for us to focus on this issue is the folks contesting whether it's Christian persecution or not are focused on the fact that it's a herder farmer dynamic. And just because there is this other sectarian element to it, meaning the herders are majority Muslim and the farmers are majority Christian, doesn't mean it's not Christian persecution. When you have most of your casualties being Christians, I think it would be hard to say that it isn't Christian persecution. And then we can get into the dynamics of what are the Nigerian laws, the grazing laws that ended up making it so that the Muslim Fulani herders have a reason to attack the Christian farmers. And I think this is really like the crux of the issue that is being missed in a lot of the reporting that's happening at the moment.
So tell me about that. What are sort of the flare-up points that lead to these? And you know, I think one thing to just in terms of your perspective on this violence, is this an organic and repetitive thing, or are these targeted incidents where you have a perpetual sort of risk of violence for these Christians, just given the natural inclination of those that they are having incidents with or running into various challenges that come up in the course of them farming in the area?
Right. I think that's a great question. And for a sec, I want us to put aside that first bucket of your classic Islamist jihadists,
Sure.
the ISIS, the Boko Haram, the ISWAPs. Let's forget about them for a sec, although that is a threat and it is a failure of the Nigerian government for not being able to address the Islamist threat. I want to focus on the Fulani herder and Christian farmer dynamic that's happening. The history is long, but I think in 2017 there was this law that attempted to curb some of the violence that was being perpetrated by the Fulani herders, because the Fulani herders naturally wanted their and this is a little nuanced here, so stay with me, wanted their cattle to be able to graze openly on farmland. And of course, that's a threat to the farmland owned by the Christian farmers. So there was this law that attempted to limit the amount or the scale of grazing that was to be done by cattle hordes and by the Fulani Muslim community. The law was not effective because, again, governance issues within the Nigerian government being unable to address this issue properly. So then you have the Fulani Muslim community continuing to allow their cattle hordes to graze on Christian farms. And that, I mean, now we're talking about livelihoods, right? These are people farming, and then there's cattle herders, and they're threatening each other's livelihoods. And I remember there was this one story back during the Biden days where people attempted to boil down this issue to an issue of climate change, which I thought was just a little ridiculous. Anyway, so the law was not effective, and it essentially brought things to a tipping point because the Fulani Muslim herder community saw it as an existential crisis, which it was, and in effect began to arm themselves. And what we're seeing in most recent days is there's really like militia level organization by the Fulani Muslim herder community attacking the Christians. So this is really how in the weeds we are with understanding what exactly is happening on the ground.
The attitudes of U.S. policymakers on this, you mentioned Ted Cruz being one that had put it forward as being an important issue. What have they done, if anything, to raise this as something that the United States should, play a role in? And why is it that this is something that there is a deep feeling of, that the United States has some role, just given what's going on, and given, quite frankly, that, as you say, this is happening in a country that's less prominent in terms of the American global interests than others where we have a lot of attention being paid at the moment?
Yeah. Look, religious freedom has always been an agenda item of the Trump administration. Look back to Trump 1.0. You'll see it was let's call it a pillar of their foreign policy. I remember then Vice President Mike Pence would appear to a lot of the Christian persecution events that here in D.C. So I don't see this as particularly coming out of left field for Trump 2.0. I get we're 9 months into the second administration, and we're just seeing it come into effect. But it is a important thing to the president, and therefore his political allies, it seems like it's important for them too. When it comes to policy, I think the most important thing that we're seeing happen is the designation of Nigeria as a country of particular concern. And that is a recommendation that United States Commission on International Religious Freedom makes every year in the report. They make a list of countries that they, based on their findings, suggest should be a CPC. And then the POTUS and the State Department either can take that recommendation or doesn't take that recommendation.
What explain for our listeners what that designation means practically?
Absolutely. It opens up the country listed or designated as a CPC, a country of particular concern, and there's a couple of other designations as well. It opens them up for more scrutiny and practically more sanctions based on religious freedom rights. And I think it's an important leverage point for the United States government when interacting bilaterally with these nations. Mm-hmm.
The actual designation, though, doesn't necessarily come with a clear policy ramification. The president, as is his wont, has talked about airstrikes. There's been, some other things bandied about in the media. What, from your perspective, should be the actual policy going forward? If this is something that rises above the level of a humanitarian tragedy like so many that we see around the world, why is it, and what are the actual practical steps that could be done in order to influence things for the better in Nigeria?
Okay. Well, when it comes to are posturing on specifically an issue like religious freedom, I think of course, there's the humanitarian, altruistic element of it, of we're the United States of America and we should give a damn about. Yeah. We should care about this issue. Okay, sorry. We should care about this issue because it's an important issue to care about. I think more practically from a policy perspective, any time that we see Islamist, jihadist, or really any militant actor that is focused on an area or group of people, they don't stop there. I mean, look at any other part of the world. Look at Hamas. You think they were done after October 7th? No, if they were successful in infiltrating Israel properly, they would have started looking at the next border they can infiltrate. So these things do not contain themselves. Islamist groups are not particularly known for having a set goal, achieving it, and kind of calling their days. So, and then you talk about Nigeria is a U.S. ally, and we should not want any of our allies to slip into such poor governance. And I could ramble on here, but I won't. So that's the policy perspective of it. Now, what do we do? I think the CPC designation was a great start. I think where we should be, where the United States government should be in the moment, is fact-fighting. We need to understand the facts on the ground, and we need to understand them fast because we have all these numbers being thrown out, 7,000, 50,000 since 2009. And I think there's going to be a lot of noise. I mean, like we were saying, talk about how it's being covered. People are more interested in denying that it's a problem than actually trying to understand the facts. So we should be in fact-finding mode. And then when it comes to airstrikes, look, I'll speak anecdotally here. I come from the Coptic Christian community of Egypt. I've been in some sticky situations. And in those sticky situations, I would have loved nothing more than an airstrike to come and kill some Islamist terrorists. But practically speaking, I think airstrikes here are probably one or two steps removed from reality. Nigeria, in central Nigeria where this is happening, it would be hard for me to imagine an airstrike solving this problem.
Yeah. I also think that there's way more potential for blowback in this situation like this. Tragically, I mean, one of the things that makes the president's policies when it comes to speedboats and things like that currently in international waters is that no one with a brain can look at that boat and say that's a fisherman.
Right.
But the problem is that when it comes to adjudicating something like this, I think awareness of what's going on the ground is very low in terms of at least my impression of what the government sees there. One thing that I do think, though, is clear is that a lot of the president's Christian supporters do care about this issue, and it seems to be one where he is now paying attention to it. But this also is happening within the context of a conversation on the right among a lot of different people about how much of a footprint the United States has overseas, how they exert power, what that should be done, what that should look like, how we should deploy our military resources and the like, and what we should expect of them in terms of having some humility about what they can do. Do you view Nigeria as being a situation that could perhaps be a test case for what that looks like, having a positive influence potentially in trying to tamp down on this conflict that has very real body counts, but doing so potentially in an area that doesn't overcommit U.S. resources or squander them or result in the worst case scenario for most of the president's supporters, which is American boots on the ground or something like that?
What an interesting question. I think the short answer is yes. I mean, all of these little things happening on in Trump 2.0 are test cases in themselves. And I think what the Trump, and of course we understand that President Trump is a master negotiator and he starts from a aggressive position, let's call it, and hopes to work his way into a more reasonable position. I think what's worrying for me about this is how unreceptive the Nigerian government has been about this issue. Acknowledge you have a problem, ask for help, or rather accept the help that's being offered to you, and let's move together as allies.
I'll be curious to see what's done in this area because it seems to me like a smaller test case just by comparison to the other things that are on the president's plate when it comes to what his foreign policy looks like. Let's go out on this. You mentioned your experience as a Coptic Christian and yourself born and raised in Egypt. This is obviously a moment when a lot of people are paying attention to the experience of Christians in the Middle East and the relationships potentially the negative relationships they have with a lot of other forces and governments around them. What kind of support does the United States need to be offering for those Christians in the Middle East currently? And what can we do to better improve their way of life by either exerting pressure on some of our allies who frankly owe us in the region currently for a lot of different things, or just trying to use some soft power diplomatically to try to deal with some of the problems that they face?
Wow, I couldn't have put it better myself. Look, with the Middle East particularly is hot at the moment, let's say, and the president is all about wins. I think when it comes to better improving how we do this issue better, how we do this Christian persecution issue better, I think and I hate to use this term, but it's about representation. When we teach our diplomats, when we talk in the State Department, and I've been in those rooms, I've been in those meetings, about religious freedom, it has always been a periphery issue. Meaning you sit down with our diplomats, our leaders sit down with the Egyptians, they talk about the Egyptian economy, they talk about the military, they talk about defense pacts. And then when they get to it, they could talk about the 10 million Coptic Christians that are being persecuted. And maybe it's a lower tier diplomat that does it, or they leave it to the USERF, the United States Commissions. I think we need to center the issue more. So on the agenda, of course, defense is first, pacts are first, economies first. And then maybe number 4 or 5 is let's talk about your 10 million Christians and how they're being treated. Let's talk about the fact that the law, the codified law of these countries treats these people as second-class citizens, if that. So by centering the issue, you signal to our allies, to the people we give billions of dollars to in aid, that this is an issue we care about instead of this afterthought that we'll get to when we get to.
You can follow Mariam Wahba on X at the Mariam Wahba. She is a research analyst at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Mariam, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Thank you for having me.